I can still hardly believe that we got to this point. The Flash, after 5 years of delays, has finally reached cinemas. Getting this movie to air was like Barry trying to fix his broken timeline, just to get further and further from his goal with every decision he makes. But here we are at last, so let's talk about how this mess of a movie turned out to be. Now, I want to get this out of the way before we begin. So, Ezra Miller. We all know what he did and what problems he has. How there was a time where we couldn't pass a week without a new Ezra Miller story, with every new case being more and more ridiculous than the previous one. And, while it was really funny to see the Warner marketing team panic as they were trying to salvage the situation somehow, there were moments where it seemed like a very real possibility that this movie will just never see the light of day and go straight to the stockpile of unfinished and cancelled DC products. I'm a big believer of the whole separate the artist from the product thing, and I will judge the movie according to that going forward. But I still wanted to mention it and say that it's completely fine if you don't want to see the movie because of him. And if you don't care at all about the behind-the-curtain staff, that's also fine. Just, don't go at each other's throats over it. And now that we got this out of the way, what about the movie?
I mean, it's alright,
Yeah, it's good, it's alright. It's certainly not as perfect and mind-blowing as the early reviews and pre-release screenings made it out to be. But I don't think anyone believed those in the first place. Some people wrote about this movie like it's the second coming or something. This life-changing experience that elevated them as a human being to the next plane of existence. And while it's not even close to being anything like that, it's certainly a fun time. It's better than most of the Marvel stuff that came out since No Way Home.
Eat my hammer!
It starts from a really rough spot because of its circumstances, and has the same disadvantage that the new Shazam did, that it's one of the last few dying kicks of the old DCU, and that really ruins a lot of the stakes that these movies have. We just don't care as much. We know it's over already. And it doesn't matter if Bruce or Barry dies at the end or something, because we know we won't be seeing them anymore either way. So it's hard to be invested in the events that happen. Not that the stakes in a superhero movie were ever particularly high to begin with. It's just something worth mentioning. Otherwise, the plot is pretty solid all things considering, except for the very last few minutes with the ending. But I will talk about that in a spoiler section later. The story itself is surprisingly decently written. I really expected a disconnected mess of a cameo fest, but it's actually relatively grounded in its approach. There isn't any world-ending catastrophe in the focus, and it's more about Barry's personal drama, which was a necessity for this movie to work, because I just couldn't care less about yet another big multiversal threat. I swear, the multiverse as a concept was such an exciting thing a few years ago, with endless possibilities and amazing new storylines that wouldn't be possible otherwise. It was an endless source of amazing new ideas. But in these past years we got so much multiverse stuff, with so little time between them. No Way Home, Loki, What If, Spider-Verse 1 and 2, Doctor Strange, Ant-Man. The whole Arrowverse was based around a multiversal setting. Even Morbius had a stupid multiverse cameo ending. And these are just the superhero ones. Besides these, we also get ones like Everything Everywhere, Rick and Morty, His Dark Materials, and they just keep coming. What even is this? Yeah, looks promising. And now we have The Flash, with the same concept and the same story that you screwed up something. Now the timeline is broken, and we have to fix it. And this was probably the turning point for a lot of people where they just stopped caring. The state of DC, and the general superhero fatigue is probably the reason why this movie flopped as hard as it has. And I feel bad for the movie, because as I said, it's one of the better ones we had recently. But someone has to take the bullet, and it won't be Spider-Verse. Not that the multiverse had any real impact on the story with this one. There was no point for Batman to be Michael Keaton and not Ben Affleck. And yeah, I know that that's how we got a fight scene at the end. because we needed to replace Superman for that to happen, but that's not really a good enough reason. I don't think it was a bad decision necessarily, but I would have appreciated a little more creativity and complexity from the writing. Like, how would Barry's mother being alive actually affect the timeline going forward? And not just, you changed something, so now all this random stuff happens for no reason. That just feels a bit lazy. And that's such a frustrating thing to say, because Michael Keaton's Batman is probably the best thing in the whole movie. I was really afraid when I first heard about him being in the cast. I think I developed an everlasting PTSD from old man Luke Skywalker, and now every time I hear about an old legacy character being brought back, all the flashbacks come up. But I was very pleasantly surprised. He was cool and wise. You could feel the lifetime of experience on him, and he got a decent amount of screen time and a reasonable part in the story. They had a very strange bit with him at the beginning, where he was kinda lost and crazy and looked like a homeless person. That was a bit out of nowhere. They said it's because, after all these years, Gotham is one of the safest cities now, and I guess he has nothing to do now, but that was still really weird and felt a bit forced into the plot. Fortunately, they move along from that pretty quickly, so it's not a big deal. It just felt a bit like a leftover idea from an earlier draft or something. They also had to include, of course, the nuts line, which felt really out of place even in the trailer, but in the movie it was just even more artificial. Like, it had nothing to do with the actual dialogue taking place before it. But it was cute. It was a wholesome little callback, so I don't think anyone really minded it, and I can be a bit more forgiving with it as well. Overall, I'm still happy that they included him, and that we could see his Batman one more time. It was a graceful goodbye to the character if that's the last time we ever see him, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. Also, just a quick side note, as he is really just a small cameo at the beginning, but Ben Affleck's Batman was also really cool, and it was nice to see him in action one more time. Our other new multiversal member to the cast was Sasha Calle's Supergirl, who turned out to be another welcoming addition to the movie, and worked much better than how most people anticipated. I liked that she was actually Supergirl, Kara Zor-El, and not just a female version of Clark Kent, what was previously rumored. That helped the character feel more unique and interesting, and this way we could see Snyderverse Kara in live action in some form at least. I liked that she had this badass look with the short black hair. It really made her unique to this movie and stand out from the rest of the live action Supergirls we had so far. She had this unnerving aura throughout the movie that she is one bad day away from snapping and just killing everyone around her, which was a welcoming change after years of watching the always patient and kind-hearted version of her, with the classic look and everything. And she was also a good depiction of the character, but it's just nice seeing something new. I feel like this is also the time where we have to talk about the CGI. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm far from being that elitist to say that I can't enjoy a movie if it doesn't have perfect photorealistic effects throughout the whole thing, and I know a lot of viewers don't care about it, or just straight up don't even see it. Like, for example, I recently tried to show my father what it means when a movie is in 24 versus 60 FPS, and for the love of God I couldn't convince him that there is a difference between the footages. So I know we all have different standards and different perceptions about these effects, and that's fine, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it when something looks a bit rough. And oh boy, this movie looks rough sometimes.
And this time it features all new rendering, lighting, and landscape technology. 16 times the detail.
It's not enough to ruin the experience. It's still a superhero movie we're talking about. It doesn't bother me when I recognize something is CG, but there are parts where it starts to be just a little too noticeable. Like at the beginning, for example, where Barry looks through that window at the building. That gave me serious Love and Thunder PTSD. But by far the worst was when we first see Supergirl fight some soldiers. That just straight up looked like a 3D video game cutscene with rubber people. Like I said, it's not nearly enough to ruin anything, but it's noticeable enough that it's worth mentioning. And now is the part where I can finally talk about the story. Because from all aspects of the movie, this is the one that is by far the most disappointing. The basic plot is very bare bones here. Barry goes back in time, changes something, now the world is f***ed up and he has to fix it. We saw this a million times, and as I mentioned earlier, I don't like how little effort they put in actually creating this new changed world, and think about what these changes might be. Instead, they just threw out ideas that sounded cool and replaced thought-out consequences with random cameos you can point at. And throughout the movie, I just couldn't stop thinking about why would Barry's mom being alive mean that Superman's pod didn't crash on Earth? Or why Bruce is a completely different person. And I know they explained it, and I know it's just a narrative choice and I shouldn't overthink it this much. But the movie is just so empty and shallow otherwise that it doesn't give me anything else interesting to think about, and it's not fast and exciting enough to just turn my brain out. So, I just unconsciously come back to the little things that bother me. And while they are stuck in my head, they just annoy me more and more. Like, another good example. Why does Batman look and act like a crazy homeless person in his own house when we first meet him? There is just no reason for it, and 10 minutes later, he's just fine again. So we know that he didn't just. Well, you know. He says that it's because there is no crime anymore, and that Gotham became one of the safest cities in the country. But I'm sorry, that's not a good enough explanation for me. I could see an argument why Old Man Luke went grumpy and secluded. He almost killed his nephew in a weak moment, and in return, the kid murdered all of his students and destroyed his school. And you tell me that your reason is that suddenly you had too much free time. Well, I mean, I guess they both did, but... And I can see that someone is already angrily typing the comment that says, actually, his childhood trauma was so deeply rooted into him that he based his whole personality around getting revenge and stopping crime. And when he achieved that, his life suddenly lost meaning, and now he has found himself alone and without purpose. And actually a lot of veteran soldiers experience the same thing, and I know, okay, but it's not your job to explain that. It should be the movie giving us all of these possible answers. But instead, they just get over it in a minute and then never talk about it again. And that makes me very annoyed. This whole movie feels like that they just threw out a lot of ideas that sounded pretty cool in the writing room, but then just couldn't figure it out how to properly implement it into the script. And sometimes it works out. Like the double Barry dynamic is surprisingly fun, and it's good to see how he gets annoyed by his younger carefree and even more obnoxious version of himself. And now he understands how the other members of the League feel about him sometimes. Like, that's fun. And also, spoiler, the big cameo fest at the end, however cheesy it was still nice to see, especially that few seconds of the Nick Cage Superman. Even with the awful plastic CGI. If you know about that project and wondered now for years how that movie would have turned out, I think the concept deserved at least that couple of frames. Just to see it on the big screen once what all that happened. But what does not work out here is the ending. And oh boy, spoiler. The ending is one of the stupidest endings I have seen in recent years. And not because it's predictable or boring or rushed, but because it fundamentally goes against the rules previously established. So, at the end, Barry reverts the changes he made to restore the timeline, but later turns out he actually made a small difference. That is marginal enough that it doesn't affect the events up to his present, so he only changed their future going forward, which would be actually a smart solution to the movie's conflict. Only problem is that they very specifically said earlier that it doesn't matter what you change. It goes both ways and messes up clearly unrelated things as well. That's why Batman and Superman were completely different, even though they had nothing to do with the changes. That was the whole point of the story to begin with. So I don't know what he was expecting, and why there was a big surprise at the end that Bruce is different. So there are two versions to interpret this ending. One, that Barry is just an idiot who forgot how time travel works, even though it was very clearly explained to him a few hours ago, and he just forgot it all. Or, he knows the rules and he just decided to change things anyway. So he didn't learn anything at the end of the movie, and was just like, well, let's try it again. And doing so, they just erased all character development he had leading to the end. which is a shame because the last scene where he meets with his mother for one last time and finally says goodbye to her was a really well done and emotional scene, and it would have been such a good and powerful ending if after that he just goes home accepting that he can't change the past and he learns to let it go. Which he kinda did, at least when it comes to his mom, sure, but you know what I mean. I knew previously what the Flashpoint storyline was about, so I knew roughly what to expect. But after seeing how desperately the studio was holding onto this movie, despite all the reshoots and controversies and delayed premieres, while watching all those other DC projects being cancelled one by one, I just started to feel that maybe this movie had something special about it. Maybe it has a really great story that they want us to experience. Or maybe it has an important role connecting the old DCU with the new one. Or you know, something. And don't get me wrong, I didn't have any unreasonably high expectations towards this movie. I have seen enough stuff throughout the years to recognize when something will probably be mediocre. But once you start to be excited about something, it's hard to look past that with any rational thoughts. And that's why this movie's okayness feels so disappointing. Even though it's a miracle by itself that it's even watchable. Overall, you can think what you want about this movie, but liked it or not, one thing that we can all agree on is that at least it's finally out and over. And with it, the DCU as we knew it as well. No more Snyderverse, no more re-releases, no more fake sequels, and no inconsistent characters throughout the movies. We will have one man who will oversee everything with one consistent vision, and one universe where all the movies can work together to create a unified experience throughout their stories, as it should have been from the start. We can all leave behind the past mistakes, have a fresh start, and welcome the true first movie of this new era. Without the bad CGI, cliché stories and characters, overused diversification, bad unnecessary jokes, and the terrible, terrible cringe dialogue.
That low you feel for your family makes you weak. You're wrong. My family, that's what makes me strong.
It's like Batman stuff.
Batman's a fascist.
Oh,